The fog rolls in from the San Francisco Bay like a living thing, slow and deliberate, swallowing the shoreline before dawn. Sirens echo faintly in the distance, not urgent, just routine. On a rocky peninsula just north of the Golden Gate Bridge sits a fortress older than the state prison system itself. Its walls are weathered, its reputation eternal. This is San Quentin State Prison. For more than a century, this place has held California's most dangerous men, its most broken souls, and its most notorious killers. Some arrived in chains. Others arrived believing they would one day leave. Many never did. Behind these walls is a place whispered about even by hardened inmates, a place where time doesn't heal wounds, it sharpens them. Death row. This isn't just a prison. It's a waiting room for fate. A place where hope and despair live in the same cell, where men wake up every day knowing the state once scheduled the hour of their death. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're re-watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell. It really helps the channel grow. San Quentin is not hidden in some desert wasteland. It stands in plain sight, surrounded by water, highways, and million-dollar homes. Commuters drive past it every day. Tourists snap photos nearby. And yet, few truly understand what has happened, and is still happening, inside those walls. This documentary is not about glorifying crime. It's about understanding power, punishment, and the human cost of justice. It's about a prison that became a symbol of finality. And it is about the men who entered San Quentin's death row believing they were already ghosts. By the end of this story, you may never look at justice the same way again. San Quentin State Prison was established in 1852, making it the oldest prison in California. It began as a wooden stockade built by inmate labor, on land chosen not for isolation, but for control. Water on 3 sides. Escape nearly impossible. From the beginning, San Quentin was designed to intimidate. Early prisoners slept in cramped, dark cells. Disease spread easily. Violence was constant. Executions were public events, sometimes drawing crowds. The message was clear: the state was watching, and it would not hesitate to end a life in the name of order. Over decades, San Quentin evolved, but its reputation followed it like a shadow. By the early 20th century, it had become the epicenter of capital punishment in California. Death row at San Quentin did not emerge overnight. It formed as California expanded its use of the death penalty, particularly in the mid-1900s. Men sentenced to die were transferred from across the state to this single location. The idea was efficiency. One execution chamber. One place to carry out the ultimate sentence. But what formed instead was a psychological experiment on a massive scale. Inmates didn't know when, or if, they would be executed. Appeals could last decades. Governors could halt executions overnight. Courts could reverse sentences years later. Time stopped making sense. Death row became a place where men lived longer waiting to die than they had lived free. So what is it actually like inside? Death row is not one hallway. It is a maze of narrow tiers, metal doors, and echoing footsteps. The cells are small, just large enough for a bunk, a toilet, and a sink. Light is limited. Silence is rare. Inmates spend up to 22 hours a day alone. Meals are slid through slots in the doors. Conversations happen through bars, shouted across tiers or whispered during brief moments of movement. Here, isolation is not a side effect. It is the punishment. Former correctional officers have described the atmosphere as heavy, like walking into a room where something terrible has already happened and might happen again at any moment. San Quentin's death row has housed some of the most infamous criminals in American history. Serial killers, gang leaders, domestic murderers. Some confessed. Some claimed innocence to their last breath. But death row does not sort by guilt or innocence. It sorts by sentence. Once inside, every man wears the same label: condemned. Some inmates turned to art, painting vivid images of regret and rage. Others wrote letters, thousands of them, to strangers on the outside, desperate to be seen as human again. A few became deeply religious. Many became mentally unstable. In this environment, hope was dangerous. Despair was deadly. For decades, San Quentin carried out executions first by hanging, then by gas chamber, and later by lethal injection. The gas chamber, that iconic green, octagonal room, is now sealed and unused, but it still exists on the prison grounds. Witnesses described executions in it as horrifying, the slow release of cyanide gas, the visible suffering, the silence that followed. Executions were meant to be clinical and controlled, but there was nothing clean about them. Guards carried the memory. Families carried the grief. And every inmate on death row carried the knowledge that one day, the walk would be theirs. The last walk at San Quentin was short, but it might as well have been a mile. Inmates were escorted from their cells to the execution chamber, watched by guards who often knew them personally after years, or even decades, of supervision. Some cried. Some prayed. Some refused to speak a single word. One former staff member later said the most disturbing part wasn't the execution itself. It was how normal the day felt afterward. Lunch was served. Shifts ended. Life continued outside the walls, as if nothing had happened. As legal challenges mounted, executions slowed. Then, they stopped altogether. California entered a strange era where death row continued to exist, but death itself was postponed indefinitely. Men who were sentenced in the 1980s and 1990s grew old inside their cells. Some died of natural causes. Others had their sentences overturned. A few even walked free. Death row became a paradox, a place designed for endings that never came. And this brings us to a crucial point: innocence and doubt. Over the years, multiple death row inmates across the US were exonerated after new evidence emerged: DNA testing, witness recantations, or proof of prosecutorial misconduct. San Quentin was not immune to this reality. Every overturned conviction raised a terrifying question: how many innocent men waited behind those doors? This doubt changed everything. Public opinion began to shift. Lawsuits piled up. The fundamental morality of the death penalty itself came under fire. Even without executions, death row remains one of the most restrictive environments in the US prison system. Programs are limited. Human contact is minimal. Mental health crises are tragically common. Suicides occur. The guards themselves face their own trauma, working day in and day out in a place built around psychological tension. San Quentin became less about punishment and more about pure endurance. Then came the governor's decision. In 2019, California's governor announced a moratorium on executions. Death row inmates would no longer face lethal injection while the order remained in effect. For some, it was a moment of profound relief. For others, it was a new kind of torment. The sentence remained, but the endpoint had vanished. Death row had transformed into something even darker: a life sentence under the name of death. Behind the walls of San Quentin State Prison, a strange kind of hope is taking root. There are education programs, a famous journalism class, even art studios. But there's a part of this prison that reform hasn't touched. A place sealed off from the rest. Death row. Today, its future is uncertain. Will it be dismantled? Converted? Or will it remain a monument to a punishment America just can't seem to let go of? This place forces a question with no easy answer. Is justice about punishment, or is it about closure? And who really pays the price when the state decides a life is beyond saving? Behind every steel door on death row is a name the public once couldn't stop saying. Headlines fade, courtrooms empty, but inside San Quentin, those names echo forever. Some inmates were infamous not just for their crimes, but for what they represented: the era they came from, the fears they embodied, the questions their cases raised about race, justice, and power. San Quentin has held men who terrorized entire cities, men whose trials exposed police corruption, and men whose convictions later crumbled under scrutiny. But on death row, notoriety doesn't protect you. It isolates you. Fame becomes another form of punishment, because no matter how many years pass, you are forever frozen at the moment of your worst act. But what truly defines death row is not execution. It's the waiting. Some inmates waited 10 years. Others waited 30. A few waited more than 40 years, longer than many correctional officers' entire careers. Imagine waking up every day not knowing if your sentence will ever be carried out, reversed, or simply forgotten. Appeals crawl through the courts at a glacial pace. Evidence disappears. Witnesses die. For many men on the row, it wasn't a countdown to an end. It was a slow, grinding erosion of identity. One former inmate described it as serving a life sentence inside a death sentence. And the system allowed it. Psychologists who studied these men observed a pattern unlike any other prison population. Some inmates detached completely. They stopped caring about time, hygiene, or even their own survival. Others became hyper-focused on routine, counting steps in their cell, memorizing guard schedules, clinging to any tiny piece of structure to stay sane. Paranoia was a constant companion. Depression was the air they breathed. The human mind was never meant to exist in a state where tomorrow might matter, or it might not exist at all. And yet, the system demanded compliance, silence, and above all, endurance. The correctional officers assigned to death row rarely spoke publicly about their work. Many carried the weight of it quietly. They were the ones escorting men to visits with family members who would never touch them again. They listened to final phone calls. They stood witness to emotional collapses that no training manual could ever prepare them for. Some officers transferred out as soon as they could. Others stayed for decades. One retired guard later admitted that the hardest part wasn't watching the executions. It was building professional relationships with men who genuinely believed the state would eventually kill them. In its own way, death row punished everyone inside it. While inmates waited behind bars, families waited on the outside. Victims' families waited for a justice they were promised, a sense of closure from a sentence that often never arrived. Years bled into decades. Some parents died before the state ever made a final decision on the person who harmed their child. At the same time, the families of death row inmates lived in a quiet, constant state of shame, traveling long distances for visits that might last hours, or sometimes just minutes, through thick glass. Two sides of grief, existing in parallel, separated by the walls of San Quentin, which offered neither side peace nor resolution. Then, as forensic science advanced, old cases began to crack open. DNA evidence started to challenge convictions that were once considered airtight. Some death row inmates were removed from their cells after years, sometimes decades, when courts finally ruled they had been wrongfully convicted. For the men who walked free, freedom came with a staggering cost. Lost youth, lost family, lost sanity, and for those left behind on the row, each exoneration planted a dangerous seed of doubt. If that case was wrong, how many others were, too? But not every inmate on death row survived long enough for appeals or reform. Some died of heart attacks, others of cancer. A few took their own lives. When they died, their cells were quietly reassigned. Their names were removed from the rosters. There were no press conferences, no public acknowledgements. Death row didn't always need an execution chamber to end a life. Time did the job just fine. San Quentin is often portrayed as one place, but death row has always existed apart from everything else. While other inmates attended classes, worked jobs, or participated in rehabilitation programs, the men on the row remained locked away. The message was unspoken but clear. Redemption was irrelevant here. Even as society began debating the merits of rehabilitation, death row remained frozen in an older philosophy, punishment without an expiration date. The gas chamber still stands on the grounds. Unused, sealed, silent. Visitors often describe it as the most disturbing place in the entire prison, not because of what it is, but because of what it represents. It's a relic of an era when execution was public, unquestioned, and final. It reminds everyone that death row was never theoretical. It was operational. And it could be again. When the state put a moratorium on executions, many believed death row would slowly fade away. Instead, it just grew heavier. Men who once feared death now found themselves fearing endless survival. The sentence no longer meant dying. It meant existing in a state of permanent limbo. In a bizarre twist, some inmates begged the courts to reinstate their executions, just to have an ending. Others clung to the hope that the death penalty would be abolished entirely. San Quentin became a holding cell for unresolved justice. Movies, documentaries, and news stories have shaped how the public sees San Quentin. But the reality inside death row rarely matched the drama on screen. There were no constant riots, no cinematic speeches from defiant inmates. There was just routine, silence, and waiting. The true horror wasn't the threat of violence. It was the soul-crushing monotony, all lived out under the shadow of death. In recent years, serious discussions have emerged about dismantling death row entirely. Legal experts question its constitutionality. Activists highlight its profound psychological cruelty. And economists point out the staggering, almost unbelievable cost of maintaining it. San Quentin now stands at a crossroads. A prison built to end lives is now being asked to justify its very existence. Some inmates entered death row in their 20s and left in their 70s, if they left at all. Over the decades, grey hair replaced rage. Illness replaced defiance. The public image of a dangerous criminal slowly faded into the reality of an elderly man struggling just to stand up. Death row did not stop time. It weaponized it. This forces us to ask, can a system built on punishment ever evolve into one capable of mercy? Is it justice to sentence someone to death and then never carry it out? Is it humane to keep someone locked in total isolation for decades with no resolution? Death row became less about the crimes committed and more about our own conscience. And that leads to the final irony. San Quentin was designed as a final stop. But for so many, it became the longest journey of their lives. A place where endings never seemed to arrive, and new beginnings were impossible. Here's the truth few people talk about. Death row didn't fail because execution stopped. It failed because it asked human beings, guards, inmates, families, and society itself to live with permanent uncertainty. A punishment without resolution. A sentence without closure. San Quentin's death row became a mirror, reflecting not just crime, but the very limits of justice itself. San Quentin's death row was never just about the men locked inside. It was a promise a society made to itself, that justice could be final, clean, and unquestionable. But over time, that promise began to crack. Behind these walls, lives were frozen in a single moment, while the world outside kept moving. Victims' families waited for closure that never fully came. Inmates waited for an end that was endlessly delayed. The system kept asking everyone to accept uncertainty as punishment. Death row was meant to be an answer. Instead, it became a question. What happens when a society creates a place for death, and then no longer knows how to use it? As execution stopped, something more unsettling emerged. Not mercy, not justice, but limbo. A sentence that stretches across decades, quietly erasing time, identity, and hope. San Quentin is a reminder that the harshest prisons don't just hold people. They reflect the world that built them.